look at it, which text, which date you're on. If you need to switch for some reason, find someone to switch with and let me know about that. Okay? All that's in the email, so we'll pay attention to that. One thing I do want to add, just as part of the conventions of referring to the biblical text, we'll be using the standard conventions in class, which is to put the name of the book, the Gospel of Mark, then the chapter number, 9, and then verse numbers. So Mark, this would be Mark, Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verses 5 through 17. If I wanted to read the entire Gospel of Mark, I would say Mark. If I just wanted you to read a couple of chapters, I might say Mark 2 through 3. Everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Okay, in case you're not familiar with the conventions. Okay. All right. Well, we need to have a quiz of the week. Get started on this. So if you will take, we need to. So take out a piece of paper, put your name on it. That's going to be me and put somebody else's name on it.
Okay.
Got 5 questions worth 2 points each. Question number 1. What is the name of one of the 3 Roman provinces that made up ancient Israel? Or put differently, during the time of the Roman Empire, ancient Israel was known as 3 different provinces. What's one of them? One of the Roman provinces for the geographical area that made up ancient Israel. Question number 2. What is one of the ways that Stoicism influenced early Christian thought? Put differently, what's one of the legacies that Stoicism, the Greek philosophy of the Stoics, gave to Christianity? Question number 3. We talked about the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. What's ironic about that term? Or put differently, what's the dark side of the Pax Romana? What's ironic about talking about the peace of Rome? What's the dark side of that phrase? Question number 4. From the reading for today, what is the most significant criterion for determining which books made it into the New Testament or not? It's like, one of the articles was about canonicity. What books made it into the New Testament? What, according to the authors, is the most important or most significant criteria for deciding which books made it? Yeah, according to the article in the JA&T, the article on canon, what's the most significant criteria used to decide which books made it into the New Testament or not? And question number 5. What is the literature that was discovered in the 1940s that contributed significantly to our understanding of the New Testament world? What is the literature that was discovered in the 1940s that contributed significantly to our understanding of the New Testament world? Yeah, what's the literature that was discovered in the 1940s that contributed significantly, some would say revolutionized, our understanding of the New Testament world, the historical era in which the New Testament, early Christianity formed? Anybody need another question? Any other question repeated? Okay, pass your papers to the front. All of them? Okay. What are the Roman provinces? Galilee, Samaria, Judea. Okay. Question number 2. What's one of the things Stoicism gives to early Christian thought? The idea of the Logos. What was it? I didn't read it. Okay. 2 main things we talked about were the idea of the Logos, the rationality order of the universe. Second thing is an ethic of living in accordance with nature, and that particularly was the argument that homosexuality is natural. What's ironic about the term Pax Romana?
Violence.
Yeah, it was enforced by violence. It really wasn't peace in any meaningful sense. Order at the point of the sword. What's the most significant criterion for determining what books made it into the New Testament?
Divine inspiration.
Nope.
Where and by who it was written?
Pardon?
Was it by where and by who it was written?
Nope.
Was it the time period?
Nope. Use. Use and dissemination. How many people used it? How widely those books were used? Arguments about authorship, those sorts of things come in later to sort of after the fact support decisions that were already made on other grounds. And we'll say a little bit more about that process, if not today, before too long. What's the body of literature that was discovered in the 1940s? Dead Sea Scrolls. All right. Okay. So, we're going to finish talking about the historical world behind the text today, and then start the literary analysis of the text. So, to pick up where we were talking about the Jewish and the Roman side. We're talking about the Jewish side, the Jewish context. We're talking about messianic expectations. Messiah means anointed one, used of ancient Jewish kings, other rulers like Cyrus of Persia, that sort of thing. And in the first century, the time the New Testament was written, the time Jesus lived, there were three main forms that messianic expectations took. So I'm going to cover there's three major forms. Some people expected the Messiah to be like a new David. King David, rightly or wrongly, becomes sort of the prototype or the model of what a Messiah should be. If you go back in the Old Testament and read the stories of David and Samuel and Kings, aside from his love life and other sorts of things, he's known for, which is conveniently forgotten in all of this, but he's known for definitively defeating Israel's enemies and uniting the tribes into a cohesive nation. Military defeat of the enemies, and establishes a safe and secure and prosperous nation. Some people in Jesus' day expected a Messiah who would be another person like David, a military leader, who would conquer, who would free the Jewish people from Roman oppression and set up an independent Jewish nation. New David, military conqueror. Jesus explicitly rejects that one in the triumphal entry of Jerusalem. We'll talk about that when we get to those texts. A second form is a new Aaron. In the Old Testament, Aaron was Moses' brother and was the beginning of a line of priests. So some expectations of the Messiah were that the Messiah would be a religious reformer, reform corrupted priesthood, establish a pure Judaism. We've got a military conqueror and a religious reformer.
Wait, David or Aaron started a line of priests?
Yeah. According to the Old Testament, he's the beginning of the Aaronic line of priests. And then there's a third kind of expectation of a supernatural figure who will descend from heaven and establish God's kingdom on earth. This view of the Messiah takes its bearings from a vision in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. It describes somebody in some translations as Son of Man, probably better translated, one like a human being. But the Son of Man descends from God's right hand in this vision in Daniel, establishes God's kingdom. So this sort of supernatural, almost apocalyptic expectation. When you hear the word apocalyptic, what kinds of things do you think of? Book of Revelation, yeah. It's the one New Testament book that is this type of literature. Lots of bad things happening. Yeah, apocalyptic ideas basically say that God is at some point from outside of human history going to intervene in human history, punish all the bad people, and set up God's kingdom for all the good people. Sort of like the old bumper sticker, good news, bad news. Good news, Jesus is coming back. Bad news, he's mad as hell. Seriously, that was a real bumper sticker years ago. Right? God is going to intervene from outside human history, destroy the existing order, and establish God's kingdom. That's apocalyptic thought. Okay? And this idea of a Messiah as a supernatural figure plays into that idea. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, one thing to note, in early first century Greco-Roman world, there was no agreement on what the Messiah would be like. Now, if you were to take a poll, if such things existed back then, or play a first century version of Family Feud, this would be the number one answer more than likely, at least at a popular level. Most people expected the Messiah to be this military leader. But, again, diversity of expectations here. Questions or comments? Okay. We also need to talk about several, well, not really several, but at least 3 first century institutions or practices within Judaism that we'll come back to and emphasize at different points in time. But one of those institutions is the temple in Jerusalem. One temple. In Jesus' day, it is, in Paul's day, it is the one that Herod has rebuilt and enhanced in Jerusalem. It is the place that is run by priests. It is the place of sacrifice, where where the priests offered sacrifices, various kinds of sacrifices to God. It is a place where, at least in some of the writings, is described as the place where God lives. It's where heaven and earth come together. And the Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the temple, that's where God's presence resides. So that's the temple. People, maybe, depending on where you lived in the Roman Empire, might get to the temple for one of the major festivals like Passover once in their life. If they were closer, maybe more often than that. But everybody was expected, if not expected, the sense was that everybody should at least make one pilgrimage to Jerusalem during their lifetime. Depending on which gospel you read, Jesus made, up to 4 journeys to Jerusalem to the temple, from 1 to 4. A second institution is the synagogue. There's one temple, but there are many synagogues spread throughout the Roman world. The synagogues are led by people called the rabbis, teachers. And the synagogues are places not of sacrifice, but they are places of Sabbath worship. They are places of teaching. In some ways, especially as you get out into the Roman world outside of Galilee, Nazareth, and Samaria, they're in essence community centers where the Jewish people could gather for all kinds of different events. So there is the synagogue. The patterns of synagogue worship basically were adopted by the earliest Christians for their forms of worship. If you go to a Catholic church today, or an Episcopal church, or a Lutheran church, the liturgical style of worship there is probably the closest to the form of worship in the ancient synagogues. So there's the synagogue. And then lastly, not so much a building, but there's this idea of the law. And if you read the article on the law out of the JAMT, we notice that what this term refers to is sometimes ambiguous, or it's multivalent. It can refer to a number of things. I'm just going to highlight a couple. One, it could refer to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which would also be synonymous with the written law. Now, does anybody remember from the JAMT article, out of all these laws, there were 3 that really were only 3 that were really widely practiced. Anybody remember what those were? Or even circumcision is one. What's another? Not celibacy. Yeah, so the dietary laws, keeping kosher.
Sabbath.
Yeah, Sabbath. Worshiping on the Sabbath. So in practice in first century Judaism, these are the ones that really counted. Not that, people necessarily ignored all the others, but these were probably the most widely practiced ones. Also, in part, served to function to preserve Jewish identity in a foreign land. And if you're not living in Judea, Samaria, or Galilee, if you're living in North Africa, or if you're living somewhere else, you're far away from the temple. How do you maintain a sense of Jewish identity, Jewish distinctiveness? These were the 3 practices that tended to do that. There is also the oral law. Let's take the commandment to keep the Sabbath. What does it mean to keep the Sabbath?
To worship on the Sabbath day, to keep it holy rather than working on it.
Okay. How do we know that from what the book of Exodus or the book of Deuteronomy, depending on which version of the 10 Commandments you read? How do we know that's what it means? All it says is keep the Sabbath.
Oh, but they said over time, like what your parents taught.
Yeah, you have to interpret it, right? And it turns out, well, one of the ways you keep Sabbath is by worshiping on the Sabbath, not working on the Sabbath. Well, no, wait a second, what does it mean not to work? And then you have to sort of extrapolate from that, right? And so this whole set of oral traditions develops to try to figure out what the written text doesn't say. Does that make sense? So, 2 important senses of the law, written and oral. Does that make sense? Okay. Then the last thing I want to note about first century Judaism is some of the diversity in terms of groups. There was not a single Judaism in the first century. I mean, in no religious tradition is there a single religious tradition. God knows how many denominations of Christians there are. But within Judaism, even today, there are at least 3 major forms: conservative, reform, and whatever the list is. I always remember one less than this. Anyway, there's a 3rd one. Islam, part of the 2 major groups of Islam. Sunni and Shia. Right? Every religious tradition, the same is true of Buddhism and Hinduism You know, there are multiple strands. First century Judaism is diverse as well. One of the subgroups of Judaism is the Essenes, and they are usually associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They collected those writings, wrote many of them. Each of these groups, I think we can summarize by talking about how they embody a different kind of religious and political response to Roman oppression. The Essenes, although again from the articles, it's not quite as clear-cut as we once thought, but the Essenes probably were a monastic group that withdrew from the centers of life out into the desert. Why? Because the Judaism of the temple was too corrupt and the Roman Empire is too corrupt. We're going to keep ourselves pure out here. So its way of dealing politically with the Roman Empire is to withdraw as much as you can out in the desert, set yourself off. Religiously, they are an apocalyptic group. It's not our job to fight Roman oppression. God will kill the SOBs when God intervenes in human history. Now, this is no oversimplification, but I mean, it's a caricature, but it's a useful one. So there are the Essenes. Monastic and apocalyptic. John the Baptist may or may not have been one of these. The second group are the Zealots. These are the insurgents, the freedom fighters. We don't typically hear a whole lot about their religious beliefs. But as far as dealing with Rome, no, we're going to pick up the sword and we're going to fight Rome. Now, obviously, you can't do it bluntly because Rome will squash you. So you're the insurgent, you're the guerrilla warrior, you're the terrorist of the day. That's how you deal with Rome. There are the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the priestly class, usually associated with the temple. To the extent that they participated, they fit into any one of the social classes in the ancient world. They tended to be on the upper class. They were the religious conservatives and the political collaborators. Religious conservatives and political collaborators. One of the things, various points in the New Testament harasses the Sadducees about or characterizes them by is to say they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. The old joke is that's why they're sad, you see. But the reason they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, it's not in the Torah. There's no mention of resurrection of dead in the Torah. You don't find a resurrection of the dead in the Hebrew Bible until you get to the book of Daniel, which is written during the Greek era that comes right before the Roman era. So resurrection of the dead is a newfangled idea. If it's not in the law, I don't believe it, and that settles it. Might be a slogan for the Sadducees. So they're wanting to conserve the oldest traditions. They're also political collaborators. They work with Rome to keep Rome from destroying the Jewish people. Also protecting their interests to the extent they're part of what counts as an upper class. But it's the stories of the betrayal of Jesus and the trial of Jesus in the New Testament indicate that the Sadducees had a standing agreement probably with Pilate, that they would hand over to him anybody who started making waves. And that was their way of assuring that Pilate wouldn't just wantonly come out and mow a bunch of Jewish people down. Because Pilate could do that. Pilate had done that. Collaborate with the government to keep this uneasy peace. Makes sense? And then there are their Pharisees. Religiously, they're the liberals of their day. They believe, for example, in the resurrection of the dead. In part because they accept, in practice, more of the Hebrew Bible than the others, but also because they're also known for paying attention to the oral law. Not being restricted just to the written law, but also these ongoing traditions of interpretation of what the laws mean and how they're supposed to be practiced. Religiously, the liberals of their day. Whether they were as legalistic as the New Testament portrays them is an open question, probably not. And there's some places where you can find that the Pharisees think that if people kept the law, then that would sort of get us on God's radar screen, so that God would intervene in the world and establish God's kingdom. Right? So the Pharisees, like the Essenes, are apocalyptic religiously. I mean, they're religious liberals, but they're also in relation to Rome, politically, they're apocalyptic. It's God's job to kill the SOBs, not us. Because we'll lose. The Pharisees, as they're depicted in the New Testament, probably, again, weren't as dogmatic about the law as the New Testament seems to portray them. And there's rhetorical reasons for that. The New Testament books are written about the time that Judaism and Christianity are splitting. And the Pharisees, by that point, have emerged after the destruction of Jerusalem as the dominant leading group, the surviving group of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. In fact, the Pharisees, in essence, morph into a new generation of rabbis, and quite likely Judaism could have been destroyed in 70 CE if it hadn't been for the Pharisees. And so the Christians and the Pharisees, and we'll see this especially in Matthew's Gospel, are butting heads like this about who's the faithful interpreter of Moses, who's the rightful heir to Moses. Is it Jesus or is it the Pharisees? And so the New Testament writers have a vested interest in rhetorically portraying the Pharisees as the bad guys. But four major groups, again, that in some ways represent different religious philosophies and different political strategies. Which is maybe another way of reminding us that in the ancient world, we don't get these hard and fast distinctions between religion and politics or philosophy or anything else. I mean, life is considered more of a whole. We don't get these sort of things siloed off from each other. All right. Again, any questions or comments?
So, they were the most survived after what happened in 70?
Yeah, the Pharisees emerge as the primary leaders of Judaism after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70. And again, Judaism may well not have survived had it not been for them. Maybe an exaggeration, but some scholars make that claim. It's in part as a way of, at least for people who are Christians, realize that reminding us that the Pharisees aren't the bad guys that they're often portrayed to be. The story is more complicated. Of course, this whole story of the history surrounding the New Testament is much more complicated. These are the main heads that we'll use. And we'll come back and make more specific connections at appropriate points along the way of the semester. But these are things to keep in mind. Right? The oppressiveness of the Roman Empire, the varieties of first century Judaism, the tensions within Judaism, the tensions between the Jews and Rome, those sorts of things. All right. Well, if you don't have any questions then, let's start talking about the New Testament as literature. Well, at least I find it useful to describe the New Testament by putting together a series of phrases. The New Testament is a collection of documents that has been transmitted and preserved over time, and then ultimately becomes seen as canon for the Christian people. But I want to break down those different parts of the phrases. It's a collection of documents. There are 27 of them that fall into three genres, at least broad categories. Gospels, of which the book of Acts should be included, in part because it follows the same literary type, but it's also part 2 of the Gospel of Luke. Gospels, epistles, which are letters. Some of the epistles in the New Testament follow very strictly the letter writing conventions of the first century. Others depart from it, but they're still called epistles, but that's stuff we'll talk about later on. But then apocalyptic. Apocalyptic literature in the New Testament is the book of Revelation. It's the only example of apocalyptic literature there, although Jude and some other books will refer to or allude to apocalyptic literature. There are elements of apocalyptic ideas in some parts of the Gospels. But apocalyptic is a particular literary genre. Well, I mean, what are these? The most straightforward is the epistles. They're just letters. The Gospels, what are they? Yeah, they are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Are they biographies? Are they histories? Not really. They're more like sermons that we'll talk about more when we get to the Gospels. Apocalyptic literature, the book of Revelation. What is it? Is it prophecy? Is it nightmare? Is it, we tend to think of it as prophecy, but apocalyptic literature is really more like good science fiction. The important one there is good. Because what good science fiction does is help a culture work through its anxieties and fears and hopes in ways that aren't as threatening as taking them on face to face. One of my favorite movies, not my favorite movie of all times, which my wife and many good friends just simply do not understand, is the 1968 Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston. Classic apocalyptic kind of movie, right? Charlton Heston is an astronaut that lands on a planet in which apes rule and human beings are mute animals experimented on, taken as pets, those sorts of things. Right? Heston escapes, and at the end of the movie he's rounding a bend by the ocean and runs across the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. Gets down off the horse, bows down, pounds his hands into the sea, says, "Damn you all to hell!" Ooh, am I going to go to hell for listening to him say "damn you all to hell" in the movie? But what he realizes is he's back on Earth after a nuclear holocaust. He says, "We finally did it. We blew ourselves up." What's going on? The movie came out in 1968. What's going on in the mid-late 60s? Cold War, Vietnam. We're trying to decide whether to nuke North Vietnam, and if we do that, how's China going to retaliate, and how's the Soviet Union going to retaliate? Got a budding peace movement. Well, by 68, there's a pretty big peace movement going on. A lot of protesting against the war. People are scared of nuclear war and what will happen. And so Planet of the Apes is one way of working out that anxiety of the United States at that period of time. It's also clearly a protest against the insanity of nuclear weapons. So there's a political edge to it, there's this kind of therapeutic edge to it. that's what apocalyptic literature in the ancient world is best understood as. We'll say more about that when we get to the book of Revelation. But 27 documents fall into three broad categories of literary genre. What's one of the implications of the fact that we're reading different types of literature? Should we read poetry as history? No, we shouldn't make these kind of category mistakes. So if we want to read gospel as straight history or a straight biography, we're going to cause some problems for ourselves down the road. If we want to read apocalyptic as a kind of fortune-telling prophecy, we're going to be misreading the literature, not going to be treating it in a way fair to the type of literature it is. So this is one of the things we need to keep in mind. At least, what are the broad characteristics of these different literary genres? Okay. A text without a context is a pretext. Part of the context is literary genre. 27 documents in three different genres. Originally written in the Koine or Koine, depending on how you learn to pronounce it. Until I took Greek in seminary, it was Koine, but now it's Koine. Originally written in Koine Greek, which is the everyday Greek of the first century Greco-Roman world. This is not a good analogy, but I think it makes the point, or it's not the best analogy, but it's the one I can think of off the top of my head, and it makes the point. It's the kind of informal, everyday language you use in writing a text versus writing a formal research paper. It's just the everyday, informal. It's not the polished, it's not the highfalutin philosophical Greek. It's everyday Greek. This is the language everybody in the Greco-Roman world had to know to get along and to get around. If you were Jewish, you also knew Aramaic, which is a hybrid of Hebrew and Persian. And if you were Roman, you probably know some Latin. You had to know Koine Greek. So 27 documents in different genres, originally written in Koine Greek, which along with the Septuagint becomes the Bible for the earliest Christians. Yeah.
Does it mean that all the things in C, are they usually in Greek? Like if you go to the Colosseum or something and there's engravings in Greek?
I would assume those are in Latin, but I wouldn't. I've not been to the Colosseum, so I'm not real sure. But the Septuagint, what's the Roman numeral LXX stand for? 70. The Septuagint, the tradition behind the Septuagint is that 70 scholars working independently of one another came up with absolutely identical translations of the Hebrew Bible plus the Apocrypha into Greek. The Hebrew Bible plus the Apocrypha translated into Greek. The Hebrew Bible, the texts of the authoritative texts of the Jewish tradition, plus the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are a number of books or portions of books, like the Old Testament, written by Jewish authors or Jewish audiences, many within the same time frame as some of the latest Old Testament books written, but were never considered sacred texts by the Jewish people. Books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, for example. There's some additions to the books of Esther and Daniel that are in the Apocrypha. Right? A couple of interesting things to note here. When the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it's not quoting the Hebrew Bible, it's quoting the Septuagint. So whenever you're reading along in the New Testament and you find a quotation from the Old Testament, if you go back in the Old Testament and try to find the original in the Old Testament, it'll read a little bit differently. And that's because, again, the New Testament writers know the Greek, not the Hebrew. One of the most interesting examples of this is when Matthew quotes Isaiah 7 in the Emmanuel prophecy. Matthew's version reads, "A virgin shall conceive and bear a son." You go back into the Old Testament and read Isaiah 7, whatever the verse is. "A young woman shall conceive and bear a son." Is there a difference between a young woman and a virgin? Or can there be? Yeah. Right? Whoever translated the Hebrew into the Greek in the Septuagint translated the Hebrew alma, which means young woman. Could be a virgin, it doesn't have to be. With the Greek word parthenos, which is literally a virgin. Right? So the New Testament writers don't know the Hebrew, they know the Greek. Now, some of you are maybe thinking, what's going on? What do we do with the virgin birth of Jesus? We'll talk about that when we get to Jesus. Okay. A little bit of anxiety is always a good thing. It's not necessarily that bad. Right, so the New Testament is a collection of 27 documents in 3 primary genres, originally written in Koine Greek, which along with the Septuagint becomes the Bible for the Christians. The last thing I will note is that it is pieced together from a lot of ancient fragments. We have roughly 5,500 Greek manuscripts of parts of the New Testament, or in some cases, all of the New Testament. The oldest piece of New Testament we have is a fragment of John's Gospel, dating to about 125 CE, which could be within 15, 20 years of when the Gospel was actually written. The oldest complete New Testament we have is from the year 300. So what we are reading today is really a painstaking reconstruction of what the original manuscript might have read like by people very carefully, some of us might say tediously, comparing the different manuscripts that we have, trying to establish province, which are older, which are newer, that sort of thing. And that produces this, the Greek New Testament. We're out of time to pass it around now, but I'll pass it around at the start of next time. Again, which represents, actually this is now out of date, this is the 2nd edition, there's now a 4th edition of the standardized Greek New Testament. But then the best translations are based out of this, and this is the best attempt to reconstruct what the original New Testament manuscripts said, how to do it. Okay? We will start there on Friday.